Welcome our Angelo Bible College students to this class in the book of Deuteronomy, and this will be lecture number 3. This is a 3-hour course. It's BI number 211, and we've been talking about some of the things in Jeremiah. In Deuteronomy, but one of the books that I'll use is this the Jeremiah Study Bible by Dr. David Jeremiah. There's some really great notes in there, and one of the things I ran across in here was in Deuteronomy 1:39, essentials of the Christian faith, and there's a story or a kind of a not an outline, but a writing on babies and whether babies go to heaven or not when they die. So it's on page 229, page 229 in Deuteronomy of the David Jeremiah Study Bible. It's a great Bible to have. And then here's one by Eugene Merrill that we're using, the Torah and Old Testament. And there's some good notes in there. And another good one is, I like Dr. Willingham's Guide to the Bible. This is the Old Testament version. He always has really good pictures and charts and things in there. And this is really good to add to your library. You know, as a student, you should be building a library. As you can see here where I'm at, this is the college library. It's books. We have all kinds of books, and this is just one part, and then we have 2 other rooms, and then I have a whole garage full of bookcases and books. I love books, and this is really good. And another guy that I really like is J. Vernon McGee, and he's written this series called Through the Bible with J. Vernon McGee, and I'll put a little bit more emphasis on his in the book of Deuteronomy when we get there. So I want to continue on. We're talking the last 2 times about historical background and what led to the book and the writings of Deuteronomy. And we talked about that Moses had led the children of Israel now for 40 years. They're coming in the plain of Moab, opposite the city of Jericho, which they would later attack and defeat to enter into the promised land. And Moses now is got a whole generation of people that really didn't know much about the law that when it was given at Mount Sinai, and were not part of the original group that died in the wilderness. You know, all those 20 and above died in the wilderness. So he's got a whole new group of people, new generation. He's wanting to teach them. So he gives 3 major messages, what we call, I guess, sermons, to these younger people to get them to understand the requirements of what God's going to require of them. And, of course, the number 1 requirement is obedience and love. So, now I want to continue on in the historical background. One thing I want to mention in the historical background is that the land of Canaan and some of the surrounding lands, particularly down on even the east side of the Jordan, at Bashan and some of those other areas there, were full of giants. And there were actually 5 different classes of giants that were in the land that Satan had put in that land. Now, you might remember reading in Genesis chapter 6, I believe verse 3, it says, "And there were giants in the land in that day." Now, that was pre-flood. And then there's a word, "and afterwards." You know, I've read that many times, that there were giants in the land, but I hadn't pay too much attention to the word "and afterwards." Now, afterwards was when? After the flood. And we know for a fact that Satan populated the land of Canaan with these demonic giants and these Canaanite people. And the purpose is to keep the children of Israel out of the land which God had promised Abraham and his descendants, and to keep the prophecy of Genesis 3:15, the coming Redeemer, from coming to pass. So he was doing everything he could to stop that. So they were, when they said we look like grasshoppers in their sight, that meant that they had spied out the land and they'd seen all these big giants, anywhere from 9 feet to 13, 14 feet tall, roaming around. And these were, and not only were they giants, but they were demonic. They were evil. And so, and they worshipped all kinds of satanic rituals and did all kinds of debauchery and all that. So God was wanting to make sure these younger people knew that, number one, it didn't matter if there were giants in the land, that they were able to take it because he was going to give the land to them. And God was going to nullify these giants. All the children of Israel had to do is go up against them, and God would help them to defeat them. And he was going to use a man named Joshua to do that. So let's talk a little bit more about the background, and then eventually we'll get more into the meat of Deuteronomy. The historical background. Deuteronomy looks at Israel's history in retrospect and prospect from a point described as beyond the Jordan, in the land of Moab, or more precisely, in the plains of Moab by Jordan, around Jericho. The location was the last campground of the Israelites before they crossed Jordan and became the conquest of Canaan. Now, if you go to Joshua, the book of Joshua, and you read the first 3 or 4, well, actually from 1 to 6, chapters 1 through 6, you'll see the place where they were camped out. And when, after Moses had died now, Joshua is preparing the people to go over, and what goes on in that period of time. To this place Moses had brought them at the conclusion of the 40 years of wilderness wanderings, and from here he is allowed to see the land of promise without entering it. For the land of Moab, Moses died and was buried. And I have a whole teaching on just the burial of Moses, which is very significant, because it wasn't an ordinary burial. God had ordered the archangel Michael to go bury Moses, and it says in Jude that Moses and the devil, Michael and the devil contended over the body of Moses. So that's a whole teaching in itself, and we'll get that. That'll be kind of at the end of this course. Not all the places named in Deuteronomy can be identified, but obviously they relate to the wilderness wanderings. In brief summary, the record refers to the journey from Sinai or Horeb. Now, Sinai and Horeb, Mount Horeb, are the same thing, to Kadesh Barnea. Here, faithless fears caused the people to be turned back from Canaan and began their aimless sojourn on the neighboring wildernesses of this area. And the fears they had were these giants. They said, we can't take this from these giants. They're huge. But they didn't put the size of the giant up against the size of their God. And they forgot that, and God got angry at them. And he called it rebellion and sin. And then he pronounced judgment upon them. Little is known of this period, but it seems probable that Kadesh provided a sort of headquarters, perhaps because of its water supply that was there. And with the passing of the years, the generation which had shown such distrust in God's leadership died, and a new generation took their place. And as I said, I think in another lecture, that isn't it amazing, about 2 million of these people died, and or at least 1 million, not 2 million, but at least 1 million of them died. And I don't know of any digs or excavations of all these bones that were discovered. God must have hid them out somewhere. Eventually, a proposed purposeful advance towards Canaan was begun. The new generation proved little different from their parents. That means they, again, not having the Holy Spirit in them, not having any strength in them, was having a difficult time overcoming sin and the temptations and things that their parents dealt with, being critical and tempting God and all the things that they did, lustful. History repeated itself both in the conduct of the Israelites and the determination of the local tribes to resist their progress. Wearisome circuits were made to avoid conflicts with the Edomites. In other words, they went around trying to avoid all these enemies. They'd send out spies and see where they were located, and then Moses would try to lead them around away from these people. There were Edomites and there were Amorites. They stood in their way, and Israel finally had to come up against them and have war with them and defeat them. The Moabites and the Midianites next attempted to defeat the advance of God's people, but both were met with failure. At last, Moses brought the people once again within sight of their goal. Now, you might remember they fought the Amalekites. And the Amalekites, it's when Moses and Hun and them were up on the mountain looking down on the battle, and as long as Moses' arms were held up, they would win, but if they dropped down, then the Amalekites would prevail. So they had to keep their arms up and praying, and they even got in and held Moses' arms up so that they could prevail. And the Amalekites, we'll talk a little bit about. The Amalekites represented the flesh, and Israel represented the spirit. And so it was a battle between flesh and spirit. And that's in I believe, Exodus 17 that you find that. At last, or maybe Numbers 17, one of the others. At last, Moses brought the people once again within sight of their goal, knowing divine revelation that they would not be permitted to enter Canaan with them. He assembled all Israel for the parting messages. Well, the first one he talked about is the law reinstated and explained. Again, I talked about the last session or two that Deuteronomy means second law, or not a new law, but just explaining the old law. The existing title, as we said, now this is a little repeat of what I've done before. Deuteronomy was probably taken from the Greek translation of the Old Testament called the Septuagint. In 1718, the words "a copy of this law" are rendered by the Septuagint as the second law giving. To Deuteronomon Totu. The content of the book, however, are much more than a repetition of the law as previously given. They are, in their true nature, instructions, expositions, teachings, and doctrines. Deuteronomy is concerned with the faith of Israel, restated and explained to meet the needs of people who are facing a new kind of life. Three major reasons for this reinstatement may be recognized. Three major reasons. Number one, a new generation of Israelites. As we said, the old generation had died. The new generation, with all the children that had come out of that, with the exception of Moses, Caleb, and Joshua, a new generation stood on the borders of Canaan. They were not the people who had seen the promised land from Kadesh Barnea and had been turned back because of their unbelief. These sons and daughters of the Hebrews of the Exodus had little personal memory of the events which had put an end to the centuries of bondage and made possible their future as a nation, and placed them under solemn obligation to their God. The new generation, generations to follow, needed to know these things and to keep them in their minds. A people's true destiny can be realized only when the lessons of the past are used as a basic material for the building of the future. It's like, if you know your history, then you won't make mistakes and repeat it. But if you ignore history and the past, people then make those same mistakes and have to relive them again. And Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, I think starting at verse 5, talks about, or first 3 verses, talks about that these examples of the Israelites and the sins they committed, I think there were 6 or 7 sins they committed that kept them out of the promised land. He reiterates that these same things can keep us Christians today, from entering into the blessings that God has for us if we do those. So he wanted us to know what the Israelites had done, and they tempted God, sexual immorality with the Midianites. They had criticized, they had murmured, they had done all kinds of things. 6 or 7 things they did that he mentions that kept them out of the promised land. And that can do the same thing in your life. So read those and study them. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, first 5 verses. Okay, second, different conditions for life. As Israel crossed the Jordan, they would exchange their wandering for settling into communities and increasing the stability and prosperity of their lives. Adjustments would be needed because they were a nomadic bunch that put up a tent, stay there for a while,